I was going to title today's video, Yu-Gi-Oh! Isn't as hard as you're making it out to be, but that's not really the angle that I want to take, so hopefully I give it a better title. I'm thinking something along the lines of stop giving opponents free wins. And in today's video, we're going to talk about a lot of the ways that I see newer players or even players that don't know that these aren't things you're supposed to do. These are just things that I notice at tournaments a lot, especially regional qualifiers. At YCSs, not so much, but definitely at regionals, I see people that are struggling to get their invite and or top their first regional, something along those lines. And these are things that I see them do constantly, and I don't think that they realize that it's not what they're supposed to be doing, and that they could actually be winning a lot more games if they just didn't do these things. So that's what we're going to talk about, because a lot of times I see people that are struggling to get their first invite and they really don't know how to improve, and if all the people you're hanging around with also don't know about these things, you're never going to figure out that they're not what you're supposed to be doing. So anyway, let's get started. So the first thing that I want to mention is you don't have to tell your opponent how many cards you're side decking in between games. This might not seem like a big deal, but it definitely is for a couple reasons. So first off, if I see, or if my opponent tells me that they're siding 10 cards, I can presume that they're siding in a lot of hate for my strategy. The inverse of that is that if they tell me, oh, I'm not side decking this game, or oh, I'm only side decking 2 cards this game, I know that they don't really have anything for my deck, so I don't have to worry about siding in a lot of anti-hate cards. For example, if I was playing Pendulums and my opponent told me they were only side decking 1 card, I could fairly accurately presume that they're not going to be siding like a playset of anti-spell fragrances. As long as I didn't see them in their main deck, I would assume that they're not going to have them, so maybe I wouldn't side Twin Twisters or Cosmic Cyclone or evenly match for games 2 and 3. So you don't have to tell your opponent how many cards you're side decking, and actually there's been entire strategies sort of built around this mechanic of not telling your opponent, because one thing that you can do if you want to, and I don't think this is worth it for every single game, but you can actually take the 15 cards in your side deck, shuffle them into your main deck, and then without your opponent seeing, you can just pull out 15 cards that you've now shuffled together. What this can do is it basically masks how many cards you're siding, because you could have shuffled in all 15 cards and then taken out 14 of the side deck cards, so your deck's only 1 card different, but now your opponent has no idea how many you sided in. One of the cases that came up a lot in was these conversion sides. They're not very popular anymore for whatever reason. I think that the game's just sort of gotten past this point. But back in the day, it was very popular. Well, I say like very popular, but it was more like a rogue choice. But back in the day, it was relatively popular for people to play one strategy, and then their side deck, instead of being like counters to other deck, it was like 15 cards for a completely different strategy. And then in between games, they would completely change their deck, and it was pretty crazy. And one of the ways that you would get away with that is by side decking all 15 in and then picking 15 out, so your opponent didn't know if you were changing strategies or if you weren't, or what exactly you were doing. So you don't have to tell your opponent that how many cards you're side decking. Also, you don't have to tell your opponent if you're going first or second until after side decking. That actually happens when both players have agreed that they're done side decking. This might not seem like a big deal to a lot of new players, but it absolutely is a big deal. So for example, if I'm going first against Pendulums, I want a lot of cards like Anti-Spell Fragrance or Dimensional Barrier, cards like that that can lock my opponent out of playing the game. But if I'm going second against Pendulums, I want cards like Regeki and Dark Hole and Kaijus and Sphere Mode to actually break their board. So what normal players do is they just don't tell their opponent until both players have presented their decks that their opponent has to guess if they're going to go first or second. So you don't have to tell your opponent, oh, I'm going to go second in game 2 until you've both presented your decks and both players' side decking choices have been locked in. That'll help you out a ton. Next up, overreacting it's not good. It's almost always done either unintentionally, where you don't realize that you're giving your opponent a lot more information than you're meaning to, or even if it is done intentionally, I will say 9 times out of 10, it's obvious that it's intentional. I see this all the time at regionals. I know it can be difficult to sort of restrain your own emotions. I remember when I was first trying to get my very first invite to the WCQ way back in 2013, two of my friends who were much better at the game watched me play, and they're just like, you know, you act like you can watch yourself play, and we can tell every single card in your hand. We can tell if your hand is good, we can tell if your hand is bad, because every time you draw a card, you make some sort of reaction. And I didn't really realize it at the time, but now looking back, absolutely I was doing that. And also I noticed that a lot in newer players or players that are struggling to get that first invite. That sort of overacting can be used to bluff, but I'd say 9 times out of 10, like I said, it's pretty obvious when you're trying to, that you actually are acting and not just doing it naturally, because yeah, I mean, it's not super difficult to tell, and I think a lot of times it's just not done correctly or well enough. We're not all actors, so it's pretty tough to actually convince your opponent that you're doing it not on purpose to sort of gain some sort of advantage. So just in general, just try to keep a poker face as much as possible. Maybe if you practice a little more, you can do some sort of acting as like a bluff, but in general, just try to be as poker face as possible throughout every single game, and then you'll stop giving your opponent a lot more information. Because what can happen is, like, if you're so sad by your opening hand, it's really visible, your opponent can then know that you don't really have any responses for their plays, and then they'll just play really aggressive and just beat you down. Anyway, though, moving on, when your opponent sits down at a regional, and maybe it's round 3 or round 4, maybe it's even round 2, and they ask you how your last round was or how your day's been going, for everything that is good in this game, just don't tell them what your last round was. Don't tell them that you bricked by drawing your Garnet. Don't tell them that you opened a hand of all Pendulum monsters and they open Anti-Spell Fragrance. Just, like, you can give generic stuff. You can say, oh, I won the last couple or I lost. I mean, they'll know your record because they're playing against you, but you can give sort of generic stuff. Just like the phrase, I bricked, is probably fine, but telling them specific parts about your strategy is such a terrible idea. I've heard so many times, like, oh, I didn't draw the Twin Sisters to out the Anti-Spell Fragrance, so I just got locked out. And it's like, okay, now I can kind of narrow down that you're either playing like Pendulums or some deck with a lot of spells, like Invoked or Trickstar, and that's just crazy. Like, you don't have to tell your opponent the play-by-play of each round. You don't have to give the feature matches of all your previous rounds, because that's giving them a lot of information. I know you might think that they're asking it out of just because they're curious, but in many cases, the people that are asking that are usually the better player of the two players, hoping that the worst player in the situation, just objectively speaking, is going to tell them a lot more information than they actually have to. So if your opponent asks you how your last couple rounds were, don't give them any more information than they deserve. Just give them super generic stuff, or just make stuff up. I don't know about that, but just don't give them like your deck strategy. That's a pretty bad idea. Also, just read cards. This is a good tip in general, but especially at regional qualifiers where you don't know all the cards that your opponents are using. It is faster to just ask them what their cards do, but it's better for sure to just read the card. I know some people are slower readers and that might be a little more complicated, but if you are a fast reader or a pretty competent reader, definitely just pick up the cards that your opponents are playing if you don't know what they do, and then read through them. Now, don't pick up every card if you know what some of them do. Just pick up the ones that you don't know what they do, or maybe you haven't played against them in a while. This way you can sort of avoid ruling mishaps, or maybe you will avoid forgetting one of their effects, because if you just let your opponent tell you what their cards do, they could be maliciously, or maybe not maliciously, leaving out certain information to gain an advantage, either forgetting, or like saying something doesn't target when it does target, saying something isn't a cost when it is a cost, all sorts of things. And you can just kind of clear that up by reading their cards. And that sounds pretty simple, and it is pretty simple, but I think it's a pretty quick way to fix a lot of ruling issues that come up. And that's going to bring me to my last tip here. Anytime there's a ruling at a regional qualifier or a YCS or anything like that, anytime there's a ruling, you can appeal that ruling to the head judge. So what that means is that anytime that someone gives you a ruling that you don't agree with, even if they've explained it, even if everyone around you is saying, okay, yeah, that's exactly how it works, don't hesitate if you feel something's wrong to ask for the head judge, to appeal to the head judge. Now, they say this at the beginning of every single event. It's in their like summary that they're supposed to read through, but some people talk during those opening announcements, so maybe you might have missed it. But never should you complain that you got a bad ruling ruling unless you have gone through the appeal process. Now, every once in a while, and I really do mean like every once in a while, it's very rare, but once a month or once every 2 months, there's a particular ruling at a particular regional that the head judge gets wrong by accident, and in those cases, yeah, you're screwed. But in general, if there's ever a wrong ruling, you shouldn't have to end the match and then an hour later look it up on your phone and say, oh man, that judge got it wrong, because floor judges are human. They're not going to get every ruling right. So usually appealing to the head judge can sort of solve that ruling issue. So don't just lose rulings that you thought were maybe a little fishy. You could kind of tell that your opponent was a little too excited to accept the judge's ruling. Just ask the head judge. It doesn't, you'll get a time extension, so it doesn't affect you going into time at all. So if it takes like 5 or 10 minutes for the judge to get over there, the head judge, because he's kind of busy, it's not going to like negatively impact your match. You don't have to then spend that time. You get it back at the end. So when everyone else is going into time, you'll have a time extension, and then you go for like 5 or 10 minutes longer, and then your match goes into time. So hopefully this video was helpful. I wanted to just give a lot of tips that I keep seeing people mess up on. They're just really easy ways to sort of improve that win percentage. And yeah, let me know if these were helpful. Let me know if you'd like another video like this. I don't know what else I put in there. This is pretty much all of the most common ones, but maybe I can think of some more stuff. And yeah, I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.